Now let us discuss each of these causes of violence. Over-centralization and patrimonial control. Liberia was founded in the early 1800s as an American alternative to abolition. The United States was a slave society, and the dominant white culture and the imperatives of American political economy at that time did not predispose the American government to support abolition. And so Liberia was founded under the principle of colonization, but as a colony of an American philanthropic organization, the American Colonization Society, not as a colony of the American government. The American government provided $100,000 to the American Colonization Society, but not to go on record as supporting a colony of the American government. That money was given to support the immigration of what they called artisans who would come to the West African coast to prepare a receptacle or receptacles to house recaptives who were intercepted on the high seas, having been taken by slave traders to Europe and the United States. And this is important. Liberia was never a colony of the United States. Neither was the American government prepared in the 1800s to go on record to say, yes, we are supporting this establishment in a direct way. It was about finding ways to say that what we're doing is to help the recaptives go back. That's the money, that is why the money was given. Not to immigrate black people to come here and form a country, a state. And so the American colonization established in Liberia, a governmental system of command and control. The original constitution of the 1800s vested executive and judicial authorities in the representative of the American Colonization Society. Even when there was a legislature, the head of the American Colonization Society was vested with veto powers over legislative decisions. Settlers demanded greater participation in the governance of their affairs and consequently challenged the absolute authority of the Colonization Society. The settlers of the coastal settlements demanded greater autonomy in the political and economic affairs of their communities. This led to struggles for constitutional changes, so that in 1839 a new constitution was promulgated which gave considerable local or county level autonomy. So there was a form of decentralization back there in 1838-1839. But the British and the French colonialists were expanding at that time, and Liberia was threatened. And with the United States unwilling to assume full responsibility for the protection of the territory that Liberia claimed, the settlers took recourse in international law by declaring their independence as a sovereign state, and they designed a new constitution. The 1847 Constitution took back the autonomy or decision-making authorities that had been vested in the counties by the Commonwealth Constitution. It established an over-centralized government arrangement and vested enormous powers in the president. This constitutional arrangement was seriously challenged in the referendum held in September 1847, the Constitution was stoutly opposed by the people of Bassa and Sinoe counties. Fighting broke out in Bassa, and in Sinoe, hardly any polls were allowed to open. The colonial physician, Dr. Luganbill, reported that out of 600 registered voters, only 269 cast ballots during that referendum. And this was less than 50% of the electorate. And of those voting, 211 voted in favor of the Constitution. 58 were opposed to adopting the Constitution. So Luganbill argued that if all those who opposed the vote had voted, the tally would have been even much closer. Perhaps if the Constitution had been adopted, it would have been adopted by a margin of not more than 50 votes. This is Luganbill's predictions, his own analysis. And why am I making this point? I'm making this point because the Constitution, which established a unitary state in Liberia and was declared adopted in 1847, it was declared adopted amid widespread disagreements and violent conflicts among the settlers themselves. This was only among the settlers. We're not talking about the problem now of how you cross the line of settlers. So what we later began to call a sacred document, our Constitution, was in fact a document profoundly contested. That, I think, is extremely significant for us today, especially so when questions of constitutional reform remain high on the agenda. Now, the Declaration of Independence and the adoption of a controversial constitution did not put an end to the contestation of Liberian sovereignty and territorial integrity by the colonial powers, especially the British and the French. These colonial powers demanded that the Liberia demonstrate effective control of the territories claimed. In order to be able to extend that control over territories claimed, the Liberian government, around the turn of the century, organized the Liberian Frontier Force and organized an interior bureaucracy. Those became the two major instruments of state control, of state occupation, and of state expansion. So what we have here is that in the making of Liberia, a governmental system was established that first centralized powers in a central state, a national government, and then began to concentrate powers in the hands of the president. Because both the Liberian Frontier Force and the interior bureaucracy were all under the direct control of the president. And then later we did one more thing. In addition to establishing these institutions of state control, the strategy for economic development that was adopted by Liberia, which, by the way, in many parts is being used today, was a strategy of giving concessions to international companies as the mainstay of the economic development arrangement. the concession economy, you could call it. In 1847, for example, President Roberts, having just recently returned to the presidency, awarded the first concession. It was to a British firm, a British group of Samuel Forbes and George Wells. They were engineers and contractors of London. The agreement gave Forbes and Wells, quote, rights to construct railways, tramways, docks, landing stages and jetties, warehouses, and other facilities for business and commercial use, and to explore and exploit mineral deposits, unquote. It also granted the right to, quote, erect upon all government and public land, free of charge, structures necessary for the pursuit of these activities. And in return, the government was to receive 10% of the net profits on all gold and silver and other minerals extracted by the company, and 50% of the net profits from the commercial use of the railways and tramways, after the deduction of a 6% interest on capital investment. Now, the establishment of the natural resource concession economy as the main strategy for economic development at that time did a number of things. Imagine we already had the concentration of powers in the hands of the president. And then we begin to put all this economic power in the hands of the president. In this way, the presidency was freed from dependence on other resources, on taxes from local people, because now it was rent that was coming directly to the government. And it freed the presidency from a relationship with the people that would hinge upon the people's support for the government through the payment of taxes. And this policy continued to drive our economic development on and off, except during the Barclay period. It continued to drive our economic development for most of our existence. By the post-World War II years, when the reins of authority fell in the hands of Mr. Tubman, President Tubman was able, with these resources, to build up an extensive patronage machine. And that patronage system expanded year by year over his 27-year stay in power. He did not invent the patronage system, but he refined it and expanded it considerably. So, what we have, therefore, was a shift from government with sovereign authority to the ACS, the American Colonization Society, a shift from that to government to a centralized authority system in which powers were concentrated in the hands of the president, and now the presidency further strengthened by rent and resources from the concession economies. That has been a significant factor that has led to the weakening of our institutions of government, to the strengthening of the presidency, and to denying our system of government of the resiliency that is important to withstand shocks. And this is my underlying point, that once you have a high concentration of power in one office of government, and once that office comes under an attack, the system disintegrates, because no other branch of government, no other institution of governance is capable then of carrying its own weight. They've all been dwarfed and weakened by excessive and over-centralized presidential authority. That has been a major factor in our history. Let me just say a little bit more about power and patronage. You may ask, where was the legislature when the president was amassing all this power? Why was the legislature dwarfed? In the evolving power relationship in the central state, the Liberian legislature has hardly been a factor. The role of the legislature has typically been dwarfed by the president. In times of crisis, when the role of the legislature was constitutionally critical, that body was hardly ever a factor. Replacing the legislature or dwarfing its role in critical times had been what was called the meeting of, quote, leading citizens. This group of leading citizens, which you'll find throughout our historical narrative, has been the core that for centuries had exercised oligarchical control. For example, in 1871, President Roy was deposed by a meeting of, quote, leading citizens, not by impeachment by the legislature. In 1883, President Gardner was forced to resign, not by threats of impeachment by the legislature, but by a meeting of leading citizens. In 1900, President Coleman was forced to resign when a group of, quote, leading citizens rejected his interior policy. In 1914, when faced with German aggression, President Howard did not go to the legislature. He called a meeting of leading citizens. In 1930, it was a meeting of leading citizens that forced the resignation of President King. Even under President Tubman and later President Tolbert, there were meetings of leading citizens and partisans that played a major role in the political and economic decision-making processes in our country. Now, there are several points to be made from this observation. First, in this political arrangement, what we call leading citizens represented the apex of oligarchical control, a network of largely settler families that controlled Liberia for more than a century, making laws, counseling presidents, even deposing presidents. Despite what the Constitution says, this was the core of our governmental system. Second, this system evolved through patronage. Every Liberian who desired achievement needed to find a point of entry into it, either by marrying into it or becoming a client, servant, or associate of one of its members. There were also opportunities for individuals with special talents to be co-opted into it. And thirdly, its control over the political decision-making gave it decision-making prerogatives over the economy. And so it is not surprising that income distribution in Liberia has been highly skewed in favor of a few families. Fourth, by the 1800s, the True Whig Party had become the political instrument of the oligarchy, and the president is chief spokesman and prime decision maker. Now, how did this oligarchical rule legitimize itself among the Liberian people? It did not always do so through the legislature. More often by holding mass political rallies and demonstrations. So the holding of mass rallies and demonstrations was not an invention of the 1970s by the so-called radicals or progressives, or whatever you may want to call them. It has been an entrenched feature of Liberian political culture. In 1871, when E.J. Roy was deposed, citizens were encouraged to demonstrate their support for the president, President Roberts. In 1930, when President King was forced to resign, women were encouraged to come out with their brooms and sweep President King away. In 1955, the Liberian government called out thousands of people to condemn what they call the plot that failed, an alleged plot, the details of which still remain unknown today. From that point on, for the next 15 years, President Tubman called scores of demonstrations and rallies to condemn one coup attempt or alleged coup attempt after another, and to request or demand his self-secession in office for many times. Under President Talbot, the Truth Party also held mass demonstrations and manifestations. In cases where the legislature sought to exert independence, and that independence went contrary to the perspective of the party, such as in the case of the gambling bill of 1974, the party called for party discipline, bullied members of the legislature, forced them, if you will, to pass a law that went against their conscience. And in that particular case in 1974, after dragging the legislature through such humiliation, the president then vetoed the bill that he had demanded that they passed. So, we have demeaned our legislature. That's my point. At the end of the day, all of this is meant to make that point. So when we needed it, it was not there. It has never been there. So it's important that we try to make it work this time. Now, the concentration of powers in the hands of the president and the weakness and lack of legitimacy of the other branches of government denied the system its resiliency. That's the point I was making. But the coup of 1980 had a far more profound impact on our political order than the killing of the president and senior officials of government, significant and tragic as these were. The coup of 1980 did not only overthrow a government, it uprooted a governing paradigm. It ended 100 years of oligarchical control. So it was the beginning of a profound change. And this is why, because of the profundity of the change on the Liberian society, it has taken us 25 years, a quarter century if you will, searching for a new governing paradigm. And we now have an opportunity. We now have an opportunity to establish a different system of governance, one that is a system of democratic governance. And so that is what I have to say about the centralization of authority and its consequences as an underlying factor of the conflicts we experienced. Let me turn to the question of national policies, the inadequacy of national policies for social and political integration. Imagine a situation in which 2,000 foreigners from a different culture arrive on this coast and try to establish a new society. This will be a very difficult task. It will be a very difficult task today, as indeed it was in the 1800s. The social objectives of the settlers was to establish a new society that would practice Christianity and extend the values and ways of Western civilization to all of Africa. During the early periods of the state formation, there were three social policies conceived and promulgated by the Liberian government. The first was a policy of assimilation. The second was a policy called the settlements policy. And the third was a policy of educational expansion. Let me try to treat each of these briefly. The policy of assimilation. The assimilation policy was begun by the American Colonization Society in 1825 and continued through the 1920s. It was an official policy to promote the, quote, civilizing mission. Through this policy, children from indigenous communities were brought into homes of settler families as apprentices to be trained in the craft, to be educated, and to be taught the ways of Western civilization. To a large extent, the apprenticeship system was successful in the assimilation of the recaptives into settler society. Now, the recaptives were those slaves who had been transported to Europe or who were en route to slavery in Europe and the Americas. But the slave ships were intercepted on the high seas and their human cargo were brought to Liberia. This is the group that was originally called the Congo people. So by the end of the early decades of the 20th century, these recaptives, or Congo people, had been fully assimilated into settler society. And so that was the success of the assimilation policy, of the apprenticeship arrangement. Now, today, all people of settler backgrounds are even called Congo people. And that is a testimony to the success of that apprenticeship system and the policy of assimilation with the recaptives. But what about with the rest of with the indigenous population? With respect to the assimilation of children of indigenous societies, this policy was unrealistic and was largely unsuccessful for a variety of reasons, including the fact that surrounding the colony was a dominant culture, and that culture was strong enough to ensure its existence and continuity even amid these new values. Secondly, the environment and the relationship between settlers and indigenous communities was quite frequently rife with suspicion and often with violent interactions. And so there was not a view that behind this policy at all times was the goodwill and the good faith. And then, of course, in many cases, children from indigenous households were abused by those who took them in their households. In some cases, they were not even allowed to enter the home through the front doors. Some were given special cups and not allowed to use the utensils. Some would eat different food or the rice crust. So you had here a situation where, as a social policy directed to the assimilation of indigenous communities, you had a failed policy. The second policy, the settlements policy. This was a policy that was being pursued and promoted actually by the integrationist elements among the settler society, in settler society. spearheaded by Professor Blyden. What this policy was about, in fact, was that settlements of the settler community would be built deep into indigenous communities, so that the people of the surrounding communities and those of the newly established settler communities would have life together, interact together, go to the same schools, interact in the same way, rather than having coastal enclaves. It was on this basis that in the late 1860s and the early 1870s, Arthington and Brewerville, they may seem to be in town today, or close to town, but in those days they were seen to be deep into indigenous communities. And the intention was to go even beyond Arthington and have even more settlements. But a number of things happened. One, after the American Civil War, emigration to Liberia decreased. And another thing that happened was that at this time the British and the French colonialists were pressuring the communities in their aggressive imperialist ways. They were taking over more and more territory, and there were lots of fighting going on in the interior where colonial expansion was at its zenith. And so there was waves and waves of turbulence. And this policy had to be abandoned because of the aggressiveness of the British and French imperial authorities. The policy of educational expansion. The government had on its books policies for the expansion of education in the hope that as educational opportunities expanded, you would have a new Liberia emerging, where values of civilization and skills would go hand in hand and would spread throughout the length and breadth of this country. But the words of the government were not matched by its actions. Unfortunately, the American Colonization Society hardly ever invested in education. And the succeeding government, Liberian government, hardly ever also. So it was the missionaries who, in fact, provided the education for our people. The Baptists, in fact, some settler missionaries themselves, like Lord Carey, got involved in educational expansion. But the Baptists, the Methodists, the Episcopal, the Lutherans, and the Roman Catholics were at the foundation of Liberian education, and they've been there since the founding of our country. It was only in the late 30s and 40s that that government-supported secondary schools began to were established in many parts of our country. The University of Liberia was established in 1861 as the highest institution of learning, and over time became a crucible for, through Blyden and others, a crucible for integration. And quite latterly, in the 1960s, the concept of the multilateral schools has greatly helped the integration process in our country. Now, in addition to these policies, and many of them, as I say, they failed as government policies, the government began, under the pressure of the British and the French, the pressure to establish effective control. Having tried now to do so through integration and failing to do so, it decided to do so by an expansion of state authority. And that is when by the turn of the century, we begin to see the formation and the expansion of the Liberian Frontier Force, as I was mentioning before, and the interior administration really taking shape. Between 1906 and 1914, these two institutions expanded. And they were both, as I said, responsible to the president. They both, or the interior policy, I should say, was one that fostered indirect rule, so that chiefs would govern their societies, reporting to the president through the interior bureaucracy. This was the classic system of British colonial rule that had been adopted here now at the turn of the century. Now, over time, this system unfortunately became predatory, so that the prime objective or the prime activities of the interior administration included enforcement of government regulations to ensure peace, collection of taxes, protection of the trade routes into the interior, and the recruitment of labor for the plantation economy. For people living in the interior, these were all predatory roles. And for many years, for decades, our government functioned in the interior with predation. Now, the story will not be complete if we didn't talk about the unification policy, the unification and integration policy. When President Tubman was elected, we must again know that Tubman was indeed a part of the oligarchy, but he was not a part of the Monrovia core. He was a man from Kipalmas, from Hopper. And so when he became president, he was very keen on expanding his base, knowing that he was not one of the rock boys. And so he did everything possible to build a new constituency. And so one of the things he did was to begin the unification and integration, to enunciate or pronounce the unification and integration policy. Now, what was that policy? The policy was to hold unification councils with a view to developing a strategy for greater integration and unification of Liberian people. And so Tubman pursued that policy through a number of unification councils. The first was held in his hometown in Hopper in 1954. The council in Hopper, presided over by Tubman, at that meeting, Tubman stressed the following. He stressed that, quote, all divisive ideologies, symbols, and nomenclatures should be abandoned. And he urged that, quote, all of us must register a new era of justice, equality, fair dealing, and equal opportunities for everyone from every part of our country, regardless of tribe, clan, section, element, creed, or economic status, unquote. So the Hopper Unification Council did not accomplish any concrete policy outcomes, but it was the beginning of defining an agenda for unification and integration. And more importantly, it gave Liberia a tremendous psychological boost with respect to its preparedness to transcend historic, social, economic, political, and cultural divisions. For the large part, after the 54 conference, Liberians were ready to take bold initiatives for unification. And so 4 years later, Tubman held a second meeting, this time in Vonjama. At the Vonjama conference, he once again stressed the themes of reconciliation and cooperation and the need for deeper appreciation of indigenous cultures. While he did not propose substantive policy changes, he did raise a very important question. And that question was whether to restructure the administrative and political subdivisions of our country so as to end the system of indirect rule. It was 4 years later, in 1962, at the Third Unification Conference in Sinoe, that President Tubman proposed the restructuring of the so-called hinterland jurisdictions so as to create new counties and thereby bring parity to all the political subdivisions, the political jurisdictions of our country. And shortly after the Sinoe Conference, the Sinoe Unification Council, the legislative and constitutional amendment processes were set in motion so that we could accomplish the political governance transformation that Tubman had talked about. This process, unfortunately, remains incomplete today. And why I say so? Because even today, as we speak, the Ministry of Internal Affairs still has as one of its operating authorities, or one of its operating instruments, the so-called hinterland regulations, the rules and regulations governing the hinterland. Rules and regulations governing the hinterland of Liberia. These were promulgated first in about 1914, they were revised again successively in 1949, and most recently in, I think, 2003. So we have still not reached there yet. There's still a lot of work to be done to bring political parity to all subdivisions of this country and to fully integrate our land such that equality would have come to everyone. So as a result of these failures of social policies, the main social chasm in Liberian society is still considered to be between settler Liberia and indigenous Liberia, and manifested, as many people see it, in the gap between Monrovia and the rest of our country. Between the original counties of the coastal areas and more recently created counties. In my view, it is only when social infrastructures such as schools, clinics, and shelters are equally developed around our country, thereby closing the social gap between Monrovia and other parts of the country, that perception will begin to change. So, Mr. Chairman, these, in my view, are the underlying causes of our conflict: the over-centralization of political authority and the failure of our policies on social political integration. Let me turn to some of the more immediate causes of the violent conflicts we have experienced. I start this closer to the period of 1979, close to it, beginning with the death of Tubman. The death of Tubman after 27 years of of his dictatorial rule, and the advancement of Vice President Talbot to the presidency heightened expectations that there will be more democratic and participatory government, respect for the rule of law, and greater individual freedoms. President Talbot himself encouraged this expectation, first by the slogans he introduced: total involvement, mat to mattress, moving on to higher heights, and by the way he dressed. He wore the safari suit, popularized it such that you can say it almost became our national dress. More importantly, and more important than the expectations that were raised, was the fact that Liberia had changed. We had entered a new epoch and we did not know it. The fruits of the limited social policies, especially the educational programs of the late 50s and 60s, when Liberia had access to a lot of iron ore money, the fruits of the economic boom of that period had reached maturity. The demands for participation in the political and developmental processes would now become great and could not be postponed. The time for change was upon Liberia. And President Talbot nurtured this change in many ways. His developmental agenda was progressive, and he accomplished very many achievements. He quickly earned the name Speedy for the pace at which he sought to move our development initiatives. Progress on his development agenda was remarkable. He loosened up the society, replaced an environment of terror with one of free speech. He expanded the physical infrastructure of our country, highways, and especially farm-to-market roads. Our agriculture was reinvigorated. Pipe-borne water and electricity were taken to our counties and major cities in our country. He encouraged the enlistment of the talents of Liberian professionals, especially those from indigenous backgrounds. Liberia seemed to be turning the corner in its development processes under President Talbot. With the development agenda, President Talbot sought to put in place a system of administrative deconcentration that would support the efforts to expand the benefits of top-down government to the villages of Liberia. Some of us remember the work of the Rural Development Task Force, which was instrumental under the leadership of Dr. Cyril Bright to frame an approach to decentralization in our country. Unfortunately, that policy remained at the level of deconcentration by the time of the coup. In regional politics and regional relationships and in international affairs, President Talbot brought us closer to our neighbors in what we could today call a result-oriented relationship. He worked to establish ECOWAS and the Mano River Union. And at the international level, he sought to diversify Liberia's international relations, breaking a childlike relationship that we had always maintained with the United States. In fact, in some of our writings, our people refer to Liberia as a stepchild. This is how we had seen ourselves in this relationship. Talbot dared to diversify our relationship, and this was very important. But the greatest dilemma that President Talbot faced, in my view, was the government's inability to respond sufficiently to the demands for more democratic participation in government. It was time for a paradigm shift from an oligarchical form of government to a more inclusive, transparent, and accountable form of government. The shift in the perceptions and expectations of government by a new generation did not seem to have been identified, let alone appreciated by the leaders of the day. Pressures for democratic change were met either by the offering of patronage or by threats of punishment, and both were frequently resisted. Let me talk about some of these dilemmas a bit more specifically. The first dilemma President Talbot faced was an ideological dilemma: which way the country would go. President Talbot seemed to have struggled to mediate, on the one hand, the demands for change that was pressed upon him by a more youthful generation, and by the oligarchy's demand for continuity and its members' fears and insecurities. Now, by a youthful generation, I mean the full range of emerging national actors that included student leaders, labor leaders, business leaders, especially those in the Liberian Business Caucus, the newly emerging political leaders, including emerging leaders in the Truitt Party. There was, in the Truitt Party, if you will, a left wing, people who wanted change. And then there were people from Moja, like myself. And there were others in the Progressive Alliance of Liberia and associated groups, the Revelation, the newspaper. So there was no monopoly of views, and Talbot had created an environment in which all views could be heard. There was a vigorous national debate. And so he was caught in this dilemma, this ideological dilemma. The old guard says, slow down. The young people say, the pace is too slow. The second dilemma that faced the government was, for President Talbot, in my view, a personal dilemma. President Talbot's family was highly skilled and achievement-oriented. Or I should say is highly skilled and achievement-oriented. Many members of his family were astute business people. Long before the president acceded to the presidency, before Talbot acceded to the presidency, one of his brothers had become a successful entrepreneur. The president himself was a successful businessman. By 1975, the business holdings of the president and his family were enormous, and they were visible and had become an issue in the political debate. Family businesses included fishing and poultry enterprises, automobile and heavy equipment dealerships and services, light industries such as an aluminum frame and pots manufacturing business, a soap and detergent manufacturing business, a textile and uniform distributorship, a vast rubber plantation in Sinoe, and rice and oil palm producing businesses, including rice distributorships. And so that was part of the personal dilemma. But there was a second part to it. The Talbot family did not only have a substantial presence in the economy, it also had a substantial control of the government. The president's elder brother was president pro tempore of the Liberian Senate. His younger brother was a minister of finance, controlling the purse strings. The president's son was chairman of the Foreign Affairs Committee of the House of Representatives. His father-in-law, the father-in-law of the president's younger brother, was the Chief Justice of the Republic of Liberia. The president's son-in-law or sons-in-law were Minister of Defense and later Minister of National Security and Commissioner of Immigration and Naturalization Service. So here was a substantial presence of a family network, not only in business, but in all three branches of government. President Talbot was a good man. He did many good things. But these dilemmas overwhelmed the system, particularly from the perspectives of those who sought change. Now, all of these dynamics were playing themselves out in an environment of economic decline. And let me give you some idea of the nature of the decline we're talking about. In the 1960s, as we said, there had been huge rises in the Liberian economy. Our rate of growth rivaled that of the most prosperous countries of the world. Our growth rate at some point were almost 10%. But it began to slow down significantly in the 1970s, such that unemployment began a steep rise. It rose to 23% in 1979, but in Monrovia particularly, unemployment reached 39%. The cost of living was mounting. Prices rose at an overall rate of 6% in 1977, 7% in 1978, and 14% in 1979. Now these are Ministry of Planning figures. And I must tell you, the Ministry of Planning during the period, since that ministry was organized, had kept really good statistics. And I think that is to its credit and the credit of all the good people who worked there. From the time it was established by Mr. Jimmy Weeks, to I think Dr. Bright, to Mr. David Neal, and others, subsequent others. It was a repository of very good financial, very good statistics, economic related statistics. Okay. Food prices rose in 1976 by 15%, and in 1978 also by 15%. It was estimated in 1974 that more than 3/4 of the households in Liberia earned less than $50 a month. It was also estimated by the Ministry of Planning that 50% of the household incomes of our country were being taken by 5% of the families. So that's the context, the economic context within which we find the pressure for change on the one hand and the resistance to change on the other hand. Now, what are some of the trigger events that came up gradually, leading to the crisis of 79 and 1980. The pressure for democratization had seen the ascendancy of several political and social movements. As I told you, there was Moja, there was PAL, there was the Revelation, and a number of groups. Needless to say, on the campuses, students became even more aware and formed student unions that paid attention to, were concerned about, and indeed advocated for change in our national governance arrangement. There was pressure, increased pressure for greater democratization, for opening up of political space. The government's response was not always positive. Liberia, unfortunately, we have a political culture, or we had in those days, and we still have a bit of it today, that promotes the view that government, especially the president, should not be seen yielding to pressure, responding to pressure. Policies and actions must always flow like blessings from the government, from the president. And this is a bad policy, a bad norm in our culture. Because government must be seen responding to the people. The people are supposed to be the ones who form the government. The government must be seen listening and responding. The leaders must not be seen as if they are omniscient and omnipotent and at their own will and desire and caprices flow benefits to people. That is why today I don't like the term deliverables, because it connotes this government delivering to people. Government and people should be in an interaction, responding to each other and together co-producing benefits. Not the supremacy of government, and then in our case, with the concentration of powers in the presidency, the supremacy of the president. That's why I like the fact that President Sirleaf has said repeatedly, she wants to dismantle the imperial presidency. That's extremely important. And so now let me give you maybe what might look like some kind of a chronology of some of the events moving into the crisis. Let's start with 1974. 1974. I've already mentioned the passage, the gambling bill. President Talbot proposed a gambling bill that gambling should be legalized in Liberia. It has since been legalized, clearly. But it was new then. And immediately there were a group of Liberians, including religious leaders, who did not like the idea. And so a citizens group was organized called Citizens of Liberia Against Gambling, COLAG. This group pressured the legislature so that the legislature could reject the bill. And as I told you, the ruling party government at the time insisted on party discipline. And those members of the party government that were in fact of the party that were in the legislature were reined in. They were called in and pressured to vote for the passage of the bill. The bill went back. 6 members of the legislature voted against it, but that bill was passed. Promptly after passing it, the president vetoed it. Now, when the president vetoed it, he gave the same reasons for vetoing it that the 6 people who voted against it had given. So here was a case not only of demeaning the legislature, but of establishing presidential authority as if it should supersede everything and should remain immune to pressures. The second event I'd like to put to you, again happened in 1974, and it was the Albert Port trial. In September 1974, Albert Port had published a pamphlet called Gobbling Business. I need not tell you who Albert Port was. He died in 1986. For 50 years plus, he was a publicist, a man of conscience, and a constitutionalist. He was a fearless and courageous Liberian patriot. I deeply regret his passing and regret that today we do not have the counsel and the intervention of this legendary Liberian patriot. But in 1974, he published this, as he had been publishing over the years, keeping an eye on government and government officials. That pamphlet pointed to the business dealings of the president's brother, the Minister of Finance. Albert Port was sued by the president's brother for libel. A few demonstrations were organized in support and fundraising of the Albert Port defense, for the Albert Port defense. The Supreme Court banned demonstrations. The lower court carried on the case and brought Port down guilty. The case went on appeal to the Supreme Court in early 1975. While that process was pending, the Revelation published articles condemning the action of the lower court. The Supreme Court then banned the Revelation and fined its members $17,000 to be paid or to go to jail. On February 10th, 1975, a group called the Mothers of Monrovia, a group of middle-class women, including some of the relatives of the Revelation editors, organized a rally and demonstration in protest against the Supreme Court rulings. Meanwhile, I should tell you that in 1974, the government had pushed through legislation granting President Talbot emergency powers. That act by a legislature that was so easily bullied was roundly condemned by the religious leaders, Bishop George Brown of the Episcopal Church, the Reverend Tuomo Reeves, Bishop Michael Francis, and a lot others. So on the day of the Mothers of Monrovia demonstration, February 10, 1975, Konan Kaisu, now James Emmanuel Roberts, was traveling from Monrovia, from downtown Monrovia to Sinco in a car. He was stopped, pulled out of the car, arrested, and taken off to Belayala. For younger folks, you may not know that Belayala was the most notorious of Liberian prisons. And this incident, the arrest of Konakaiso, sent shock through the community. It sent terror through the ranks of those who opposed the government. And so they were quickly to assess what this means, to perhaps here evaluate the situation and to conclude that we had now entered a new era of terror and repression. And so the Albert Port case awaited the review by the Supreme Court, and the case ended when the Minister of Finance, Mr. Talbot, was unfortunately killed in a tragic plane crash. The third incident I'd like to put to you was the controversy surrounding the property clause for voting. Liberia had on its books, in its electoral laws, that a voter needed to own property in order to vote. Not just to hold office, but to exercise the franchise. You must own property. That was the law of the land in 1975. It was the law of the land even earlier. But I take 1975 because in that year there were presidential elections. And President Talbot was elected with a vote of slightly more than 800,000 of the electorate. At that time, the property clause was not enforced. 2 years later, in 1977, Bishop Benny Warner was elected Vice President of Liberia, and he too was elected by a vote that slightly exceeded 800,000. And on that occasion also, the property clause was not enforced. And by the way, Bishop George Brown, Bishop Michael Francis were among leaders, religious leaders, who roundly criticized Bishop Warner for accepting the vice presidency, while at the same time serving as Bishop of the United Methodist Church. This dragging of the church into politics considerably demeaned the impact that the Methodist Church, as part of the conscience of this society, could have played when Bishop Vice President Warner held reins in both church and state. So in early 1978, I announced my candidacy to become mayor of Monrovia. And I stressed at that time I would be running as an independent and not as a member of the Truitt Party. You may ask me why this intervention, but I can tell you this intervention was due to the fact that, given my training and experience at that time, I could see that coming down the road by the year 1982, 1983, when general elections would be held, there would be a serious pressure for multi-party politics, and that the electoral system had better be ready at that time to respond with integrity to the evolving multi-party democracy that was at hand. My announcement was not an individual decision. It was a decision taken by the group of which I affiliated, Moja, and I'm proud of that. And we decided that we should put up a candidate, not as a Moja candidate, and it need not be a Moja person. Before my candidacy was announced, we had sought to find candidates in other people. We went around asking people, because the idea here was to begin now to address the legal issues that needed to be addressed so that we can avoid violence and a breakdown of our system come 1982, 1983, when presidential elections would be on hand. At this time, you must remember, the Progressive Alliance of Liberia had already announced its intention of organizing a political party and of contesting elections. So, in May 1978, there were legislative elections held, and the property clause was not enforced. It was about June, or around about that time, in 1978, that the government announced that in the ensuing mayoral elections, the property clause will be enforced. So you see the double standards in the making, the resistance to the process of change. These elections, the mayoral elections, were scheduled for November 13, 1979. And so we began a lot of negotiations, consultations, numerous meetings with the president, with the legislature, with the religious community, enlisting the support of everybody to ensure that this property clause would be removed. Why? Because it had never been enforced, but more importantly, because the era of democracy that Liberia faced in 1979, if it were to move forward, demanded that such archaic law be removed from the books. But that clause now was being used as a weapon to stifle democratic progress, to keep political space closed. And we were then determined, using the electoral process to widen and broaden democratic space. And so through the campaign for mayor and through advocacy to get the laws changed, on October 29, 1979, October 29, 1978, President Talbot called a meeting in which he invited the leadership of Moja, of which I was a part, of PAL, and of the Truic Party. He invited leading clergymen, and at that meeting, he explained that in his view, there was need for time so that the legislature could remove the property clause. We supported that decision to postpone the elections until June 1979 so that the property clause could be removed from the books. But events were then to take a different turn, because After this meeting with the president and the agreement to postpone the elections, some new developments took place. In March 1979, in March 1979, the Progressive Alliance of Liberia in March 1979, Moja celebrated its anniversary on March 21st at the Sports Commission. And at that meeting, the Progressive Alliance of Liberia, the leader of the Progressive Alliance of Liberia, announced that there would be a demonstration to oppose the price increase that was being considered in rice, in the sale of rice. And there are a number of developments that surrounded that flowed from that decision, and that indeed led to what we now call the rice riots. During that period, with the beginning of the mayor campaign, I tried then to keep some notes. And so after the riot, when the president appointed a commission to investigate what happened, the Brownell Commission, I was asked to make a presentation to that commission on the causes of the riot. I made a presentation to one of the committees of that commission, the Social and Political Committee. This was sometime in May 1979. I have here, Mr. Chairman, a copy of that presentation that I made on that occasion. I was able to get a hold of this copy, this presentation made almost 30 years ago, from Professor Elwood Dunn. I will submit this statement to your committee, and although it is a bit long, I would like to read it, because it gave you my perspective, 25 years ago or thereabouts, almost 30 years, 1979, March, 29 years ago, on those events. And I would ask that you check this out against the records of the commission. I have not changed a single word, even though there are one or two recommendations I made in this at that time as a young man that I may not really want to make today. And those, if you want to, we can discuss them. But let me read what I wrote 29 years ago to that committee. Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, thank you very much for inviting me to present to you my views of the causes of the recent civil disturbance which took place in Monrovia on April 14. As you know, I am an assistant professor of political science at the University of Liberia, a founding member of Moja, a founding member and current chairman of the Committee on Membership and Vigilance, of the Movement for Justice in Africa, MOJA, and Director of Special Projects, Post-coup Incorporated. Responsibility for the civil disturbance has been placed at various times and in a multitude of ways on all of these organizations and institutions or some of their members. 7 of the men now imprisoned in connection with this development are members of MOJA, and 5 are students of the University of Liberia. One of the men held in prison for 2 weeks on a false charge of being a member of a Progressive Alliance of Liberia, and released only after painstaking efforts on the part of his relatives and associates to establish that he was not a member of PAL, is both a MOJA brother of mine and a colleague in the Department of Political Science at the University of Liberia. I am very pleased and proud to be a colleague of such an honest and dedicated patriot as Dr. H. Boima Fambule Jr. You will also recall that Mr. Dew Twangler Mason, Chairman of the Committee on Research and Information of MOJA and Director of Research and Training of Post-coup Incorporated, was also arrested and imprisoned. Mason's arrest took place at a time when he was participating in a government-organized seminar in Sinoe for the training of Peace Corps volunteers. My relationship with Mr. Mason is long-standing, and I'm very pleased and proud to be his colleague and associate. I have gone to such length to establish my association with these groups and individuals to stress that the activities of these individuals and organizations are fully known to me, and as such my testimony to you will provide insights as to their dedication to participation in the national recovery and reconstruction process. Both Post-coup Incorporated and the Movement for Justice in Africa have written and submitted to the President of Liberia detailed proposals on several aspects of a possible strategy for national reconstruction. These organizations stand ever ready to participate in the efforts towards national reconstruction. Both organizations await reaction from the government. In addressing the issue at hand, permit me, Mr. Chairman, to draw a distinction, though some may think an artificial one, between the immediate cause of the civil disturbance of April 14 and the general and fundamental causes. This is not to suggest that the immediate bears no relationship to the general and systemic. In fact, to the contrary, it is a one-shot traumatic manifestation of deep-seated systemic irregularities. To be blunt and to the point, the immediate cause of the civil disturbance was a faulty series of decision-making on the part of the government concerning the critical commodity of rice. I say this in full knowledge of the official account of the incident as published by the Ministry of Information and Cultural Affairs and Tourism, with deference to the public posture assumed by government. The first in the series of wrong decisions made by the government was the decision to postpone a decision on the all-important question of a possible increase in the price of rice. According to official statements, the government the question of a possible increase in the price of rice was first introduced in 1977. Government ruled against it. The Minister of Agriculture reintroduced the issue in her annual report in 1978. This time it was being taken as a viable option. In early February, the mass media began floating the idea as if to prepare the public for an eventual increase. At this point, the government had an unusual opportunity to sample public opinion on the issue. Public reaction was swift, strong, and negative. One would have thought that the issue would have been dropped or the government would have immediately found other ways to assist the producers. After all, the Liberian government has established the machinery and mobilized resources to increase productivity and returns to rubber farmers and to coffee and cocoa producers. In all candor, public outcry against the possible increase in the price of rice was not unfair. Government statistics show that the average income of an urban worker is $80 per month. Even at the current price of $22 a 100-pound bag of rice, a non-substitutable item in the Liberian diet, consumes about 28% of the monthly wages of an urban worker. Since many urban workers cannot afford such enormous outlay at one time, they are forced to buy rice at a retail rate and thus spend much more, as much as 35 to 45% of their wages on an incremental basis for rice, a single and critical commodity. After the purchasing of rice and the payment of rent, which again is exorbitant, the urban worker would have spent close to 95% of his wages if he would not have already spent his full wages and begun crediting against the next month's pay period. And so even at current prices, the urban worker totters on the brink of survival, living from month to month, largely in a situation of chance. Even at more affluent levels, with the extended family as an entrenched institution, a number of semi-affluent homes consume more than a single bag of rice per month. At $22 per bag, the cost of rice is a strain even for people at such levels. I'm trying to make 2 points here, Mr. Chairman. First, given these realities, the question of a possible increase in the price of rice should not have even been entertained. Not only did government entertain the question, it was in the process of giving it very serious consideration. The second point here is that given these realities, any group, the Association of Liberian Morons, Amalgamated Infants Incorporated, if there are any such groups, could have mobilized the Liberian people to bring pressure on government not to increase the price of rice. By considering such an increase and by further permitting a decision to linger, the government provided the fuel to ignite a fire. No conspiracy was needed. No acts of treason needed to be contemplated. And even if the so-called wicked, and people were being called wicked at the time, used this development for their selfish designs, was it not the government who created the conditions and nurtured the issues that could be used? Please ponder this. When the Progressive Alliance of Liberia announced its demonstration, one would have thought that the government would have taken swift action to defuse the issue. Government could have taken one of two wholesome options. It could have announced a decision not to increase the price of rice, or it could have permitted the demonstration so as to get a true picture of public opinion. In permitting the demonstration, government could have extended police protection to the demonstrators, delineated routes to be taken, and put the responsibility of ensuring that demonstrators respect the rights of others on the leadership of the demonstration. Instead, the government took a second wrong decision, a decision to ban the demonstration and to advertise that ban over radio. A brief informal survey which I had conducted since I received your invitation, shows that a very large number of people who were preparing to attend the demonstration, had it taken place, heard about the demonstration through the radio broadcast banning it. In other words, the decision to ban the demonstration was interpreted as an indication that the government did not want to fathom the extent of popular opinion, and as if to add salt to a wound, the advertised threat contained in the broadcast was seen as government's determination to suffocate popular opinion of the people with the massive use of force. Thus, the government had not only provided the fuel, but had now doused an explosive situation with the fuel. The third wrong decision made by the government was indeed the massive use of force. The deployment of large contingents of soldiers and police armed with tear gas, batons, and above all, live and fatal bullets, and the decision to shoot into unarmed, unorganized, and frustration-laden crowds of poor people. Common sense could tell us that, and a social scientist would confirm, that any economic group such as a crowd which was gathered around the city to attend the demonstration being being frustrated by the denial of a desired and much needed opportunity to express a view, and greatly endangered by the killing of scores of its members, will inevitably turn to rioting and looting and to every other violent method of expression available to it. And so the suggestion that the rioting and looting could not have been done by Liberians and that the whole episode was un-Liberian seemed to imply that Liberians are a different set of people incapable of responding as social and political beings to extraneous social and political conditions. It is not strange that the rioting and looting only began after shots were fired by the police and people killed. In this act, the government had finally lit the match which caused the explosion. This was its third erroneous decision. Mr. Chairman, ladies and gentlemen of the committee, I perceive one fundamental attitude or assumption on the part of government which underlies all of its errors in dealing with the situation. This basic assumption is that government, the custodian of the collective power and guardian of the supreme interests of the people, ought not to be pressured by the people or any segment of them. That government makes its decision in its own time, and that any attempt to pressure government is a villainous challenge to the authority of the state, to the solemn responsibility of government, and constitutes, quote, a diabolical and satanic act of treason. These are words used quite frequently during that time in the newspaper and by officials. This is my aside. A diabolical and satanic act of treason calculated to overthrow constituted authority. Such arrogance of power is a dangerous posture. It implies that government and not the people is the basis of sovereignty. It creates needless antagonisms between the people and their leaders and nurtures a groundswell of pent-up disgruntlement which in time seeks escape through avenues which are disruptive to the body politic. I submit, Mr. Chairman, that the application of pressure to government is a healthy method of political intercourse in all political systems, no matter the ideological complexion. The more resilient government becomes to the pressures of the people, the more it develops its own raison d'etre. A government that requires massive and constant pressure of support, massive and constant measures of support must simultaneously provide possibilities for equally massive and constant measures of request and demands. This is what the democratic process is all about, and this is the pattern through which emerging Liberian social and political reality, attended as it is by growing awareness and national consciousness, awakened largely by the Liberian leaders themselves, this is how change has become inevitable. It cannot be encouraged and muscled at the same time. The Liberian people cannot be called upon to be totally involved, self-reliant, and to move from mat to mattresses, while the process of involvement remains circumscribed, the mechanism for self-reliance remains severely conditioned, and the mattress out of reach. These, Mr. Chairman, ladies and gentlemen of the committee, are the issues of the immediate cause of the civil disturbance and as I see them. They show why the Progressive Alliance could seize an opportunity to exploit an unpopular issue created by government, and why students of the University of Liberia, acting as conscience of society, had no alternative but to oppose the increase in the price of rice. Mr. Chairman, ladies and gentlemen of the committee, what I have thus far done is to narrate to you my interpretation of the immediate causes of the April 14 civil disturbance. What I will now attempt, with your indulgence, is to employ some degree of insight and with the benefit of hindsight to explain some of the social, economic, and political policies and practices of our society to bring the more fundamental causes of this disturbance into the fore. I submit that there are some serious economic conditions which have contributed substantially to the April 14 development. Most of these are known to the government because data exposing them have not only been made available by the government, but have been widely used by government officials, even by the president himself. It is known that 90% of Liberians live at subsistence levels or very close to subsistence levels, that real wages across the economic spectrum has declined considerably in this decade, that for agriculture and mine workers, this decline in real wages has been as sharp as 40% and above, and 40% and above since 1971, that unemployment in urban Liberia is as high as in the 30s, and expects to get worse by 1982, when 75,000 additional jobs will need to be generated by our economy, which will only be able to generate 25,000 additional jobs. That inflation runs well in excess of 15%, all of which is not due to international causes, but substantially to local profiteering and fat skimming, and that Monrovia's average income of $80 per month is woefully inadequate to meet the minimum survival costs of a family of four, estimated at $113 a month. These are only a few of the statistical indices of poverty in Liberia. If we look at the economic program which over the last 4 years have been designed to combat mass poverty, we find their performance disappointing and their results negligible. 3 of the programs which have been designed to combat mass poverty have been the Integrated Rural Development Program, the low-cost housing, and the restructuring of the tax system. I submit, Mr. Chairman, that these programs have not accrued the desired results. Since 1976, the government has been implementing an Integrated Rural Development Program. Results of this experiment are still at best inconclusive. Cooperatives, the bedrock of this approach, are still tottering on the brink of survival where they still exist. 80% of rural small farmers remain largely unaffected, and increase in the production of rice increase in the production of rice have not been substantial enough to reduce the even spiraling increase in rice importation. The benefits, if any, which have developed from our integrated rural development schemes have not been sufficiently attractive to stem the intensifying drift from rural Liberia to urban Liberia. They have not been substantial enough to consolidate rural societies. After 4 years of experimentation, our rural development scheme still remains timid. The housing scheme, which began 6 years ago to provide shelter for low-income earners, has also been disappointing in its results. Since 1973, at least 5 housing projects have been completed or initiated: the Amical Cabral, Stephen Talbot, E.J. Goodrich, New Georgia, and Matadi. Only the New Georgia project has been designed to actually cater to low-income earners. Furthermore, the impact of the 180 units at New Georgia will remain negligible. The pressing problem of urban housing has not been fully studied and is not being adequately addressed. No formula has been found to the question of rural housing, a problem which has so far been ignored if the unsuccessful attempt at JOA is to be excused. The revised tax scheme, which was meant to relieve the burden of the poor and exact more from the wealthy, has not succeeded. No sooner has the austerity tax been lifted from urban low-income earners than demanding political and social contributions were slapped on. As far as the rural poor are concerned, the HOT and development tax still maintain their stranglehold, consuming at least half of the average rural income. In addition to these programs, there are some serious socio-economic problems attending the ownership and use of land and labor relationships in Liberia. We are gradually seeing the isolation of rural villages and the enclosing of hitherto rural farmland by urban-based gentleman farmers, a budding rural elite, and by private concessions. The land is indeed changing hands, moving from the hands of the many to the hands of the few. This is a potentially explosive situation. Labor relations is deteriorating. Trade unions no longer represent the legitimate aspirations of their members, and thus a wave of disaffection, of disaffiliation from the major unions is being witnessed. Cases of illegal dismissals are soaring, and effective avenues for redress are closing. Labor is constantly getting restless due to lack of close attention to its problems. At the bedrock of these economic problems is our political situation. The decisions which control the Liberian economy and all other aspects of life in Liberia and any other country for that matter are largely made in the political process. When we examine the Liberian political process, we find certain major problems. One of the political developments for which the present administration deserves the greatest of credits is the restoration of certain basic liberties. Freedom of speech is a hallmark of the Talbot administration. The presentation of this frank and candid assessment of the Liberian society is itself a testimony to the degree of freedom of expression permitted by this administration. However, the consequences of freedom of speech and the requisite attendant political developments have not been accommodated by the political process. Freedom of speech is not an end in itself, but an instrument to democratize decision-making. This, unfortunately, productivity, and personal suitability. As a result, there are several square pegs in round holes. Corruption and nepotism abound. In the past, the decision-making process was characterized by the absence of planning. While this problem has been resolved, there now exists a situation in which plans are not permitted to experience full execution. Every major social and economic plan of the Liberian government, from such sectoral plans as those concerning agriculture and education to the National Socio-Economic Development Plan, has found itself either rendered unimplementable or substantially unfulfilled because of the massive interference of ad hoc decisions which have taken precedence over established priority over them. Turning to the relationship between the people and their political institutions, we find a gulf. Popular participation in the selection of political leaders is too circumscribed. There is a critical need for the democratization of the selection process, for the participation of the people in the selection of their leaders, and in making the decisions which affect their lives. The mass media has contributed substantially to the over-centralization of decision-making and to the greater need for ad hoc decision-making in contrast to planned decision-making. The media has overly exposed the president, presenting him as the Superman, all-powerful and omniscient. Its ever-present cameras and microphones have demanded crowd-pleasing decisions every time the president speaks. But one of the greater disservices of the mass media, which stems from overexposure, is the reduction of the credibility of government pronouncements. Because the media have been oriented to heaping praises and portraying a demigod-like image of the president and the infallibility of government in a society in which both the president and government are known to be the presidency and the government are known to be occupied by fallible men, where education and work experience have heightened consciousness, the media have succeeded in creating an erosion of the credibility of government. It has exaggerated both government's capacity and willingness to deliver. Mr. Chairman, ladies and gentlemen of the committee, permit me to look briefly at one of the last segments of our society. I refer to the social norms and practices of our society which further widen the chasm between the haves and have-nots and form the basis for serious social conflict. Socially, Liberia constitutes two worlds. The one is the world of the haves, which is characterized by affluence and ostentatious lifestyle. The symbol and trappings of wealth and the good life are brazenly flaunted. This is the world of Cadillacs, Jaguars, and Mercedes-Benzes, a world of striped three-piece suits, sprawling mansions, and video recording sets. At that time, videos were news. Liberians of this world are among the most suave, cosmopolitan, and jet-setting types of Africa, more in tune with the fashions of New York, Paris, and London, and more comfortable with the trappings of Western luxury living than any other group of socialites in Africa. Existing side by side with this luxury group and being shamelessly exploited by it are the poor people of Liberia, parched in the wretchedness of poverty, dazzled by the endless possibilities available to the affluent, languishing in the squalor of the city and the harshness and austerity of rural villages. The Ministry of Planning and Economic Affairs has documented this. It has posited that in Liberia, less than 4% of the people own 60% of the wealth. It is such hoarding and vaunting of wealth not enough provocation to awaken the poor to restlessness? Should a man who is hardly able to pay 50 cents for one smoked fish and 25% for a cup of rice look with pleasure and delight on another who entertains his friends at regular buffet meals at $25 a head? And so, Mr. Chairman, I believe it is imperative that in a society like ours, where ownership of the resources is so skewed in favor of the few, where opportunities are abundant in some quarters and very scarce in others, where the paths to wealth rest on the shoulders of the poor, and where careless vaunting of wealth is the order of the day, it is imperative that this process be checked, that the appropriate policies be implemented to correct this awkward and ugly situation. Several areas have been discussed, and numerous developments in the Liberian society have led to the developments of April 14, and they have been touched upon. A bleak picture has been painted. To do otherwise would be dishonest. Now, where do we go from here? I am of the view, Mr. Chairman, that Liberia has to chart a new course which should be fundamentally different from our current course. Our economic problems and the plight of our urban and rural poor can only be remedied if a decision-making framework based on mass participation is adopted. A major first step is already being prepared. It is contained in the working documents of the Rural Development Task Force headed by Dr. Cyril Bright. The bottom-up approach which this proposal promises seeks to organize national decisions, making political and economic participation from the levels of the towns and villages of rural Liberia to the cities and towns of urban Liberia to the national level. This framework should see the true democratization of Liberian society and the essence of total involvement. It would also be very necessary for this nation to devise a code of conduct for public officials where conflict of interest will be removed and where an individual's public office will not be used as the base for greater accumulation, where corruption and nepotism can be prevented. It is also important to restructure the process of recruitment to public office. There is need for the meaningful participation of the people in the selection of their legislators, superintendents, chiefs, and presidents. The present party caucus system is inherently closed, blatantly unfair, and mechanically controlled from the top. The land question needs to be addressed. It is time that a broad-based land reform program be undertaken where the limits can be placed on the amount of land to be owned by any one person. and the large numbers of technically landless, especially of rural areas, can be assured of land ownership. The rice issue should be carefully studied, and the production of rice to feed our people should become a national priority, for which there should be a national mobilization effort. The structure of wages should be examined and a national policy instituted to ensure minimum wages remain compatible with cost of living. The strategy for economic development should be tailored so that employment-generating economic activities could dominate the economy. Full employment and practices should be instituted by the government. Industrial relations must be seriously improved, and incentives such as partial ownership of industry should be offered workers. All workers, especially agriculture workers, should have the unencumbered right of association as they see fit. The law or laws of Liberia, especially the stringent shackles on strikes, should be reviewed, and the conditions for full expression on the part of workers should be created. Hot and development taxes should be abolished in rural Liberia. The emphasis on vocational and technical education should be quadrupled. A greater emphasis in this respect should be put on non-formal training. Regarding the natural resources of the state, all such resources should be effectively owned by the state. A new look should be taken at the conditions of resource exploration, and greater national control should be exerted. With the institution of proper training and technical and management skills, Liberians should be in a position to exercise effective control over the natural resources. A new and healthy respect for the poor should be encouraged through policies and practices of government. The entire orientation of government should be in favor of the interests of the masses of the Liberian people who are poor. A prerequisite to any attempt at national reconstruction has to begin with the complete resolution of the April 14 civil disturbance. The first step that should be taken by government toward this end is the institution of general and total amnesty for all those currently charged and imprisoned in connection with the incident. This will constitute an enormous act of goodwill and reconciliation. There are also practical benefits in general amnesty. The Liberian government has usually boasted that there are no political prisoners in Liberia. This boast cannot be made at this time, and this is a critical time when, in the wake of the OAU 7 to 9, the international press is focusing penetratingly on Liberia. Already, Liberia is faring very badly in the international press since the April 14 development. The president himself will be seriously compromised as a peacemaker and chairman of the OAU if the issues of April 14 are not completely resolved. How can international recognition and respectability come to an OAU chairman who wields emergency powers and holds political prisoners? What human rights examples can we speak of? The granting of general and total amnesty will be immediately followed by a campaign of national mobilization of young people for the successful hosting of the 1979 OAU Summit Conference. The proposal put forward by the Movement for Justice in Africa could in many ways serve as a model for undertaking a general amnesty and mobilization for the OAU conference. The University of Liberia at this point could be crucial in the mobilization campaign. Another important issue that needs full consideration is the actual incidents of April 14. Our people should be able to learn from their mistakes. A whitewashed job can teach no honest lesson. It is important that a true and accurate account of the development of April 14 be taken. Who ordered the police to shoot to kill? Why were they ordered to shoot to kill? What role did the Liberian National Guard really play? How many people were actually killed? Who were they? What kind of bullets were used? Besides these questions, it is important to investigate the insanity displayed by many government officials, especially some county superintendents, who went on a rampage, rounding up and detaining innocent people. The situations in Grand Jede and Nimba counties demand serious special attention. Hundreds of people in these two counties are harassed and imprisoned. New checkpoints were set up by local authorities, and passengers traveling through these counties were sometimes detained for as long as 8 to 10 hours, and their properties taken away from them. There is also the case of the Reverend Dr. Nya Tayo, whose house in Gompa City, Ganta, was ransacked by Superintendent Domba's men. Tayo was pursued into Guinea by a posse constituted by the local officials of Nimba. Nothing is known of his whereabouts. An investigation into this matter is urgent. The University of Liberia, the nation's highest institution of learning, is another important issue for close consideration. The question is, what role does the government expect of the University of Liberia? Is the university expected to be a center of learning, of critical thinking, and the conscience of the society, as universities are in most societies? Or should the University of Liberia be considered yet another government bureaucracy, perhaps a Ministry of Higher Education? This issue needs resolution. Finally, Mr. Chairman, we need to remind ourselves that history has put us all on trial. President Tolbert appointed your commission and mandated it to undertake a full and authentic investigation. You, in fulfillment of your mandate, have invited frank and candid testimonies from the broad masses of the Liberian people. We expect that your commission will prepare a report reflective of the serious issues which are raised with you. The President also promised to implement your report. The public and history expect him to keep his word. Thank you very much. This was my submission. It's been at length. I wanted to read this because I wanted to give you a flavor of the tenor of the times, of the issues that were at stake, of the mode and the pulse of the people, especially people like me, how we saw the issues. I must say to you that on some of those recommendations, I have since changed my mind. I don't think state ownership of all the land is a good idea. There is wisdom, I think, in years. And so for me, this document, I thought to put it forward to you because I think it was important to give you some ideas of how we saw the trigger factors surrounding the war. Now, let me fast forward and go to some of the issues, some of the related issues surrounding the coup. Now, after the OAU meeting in 1979, of course, it was as if this country, after the mayoral contest, took a sort of a collective break from the kind of intense political activities that were going on to see the OAU through. And I think it's to the credit of all Liberians, and I think we have it in us when faced with a situation where we are all called upon to collectively show our best foot, as we do when there's a football game. No matter where we are, we rally. And this is a good thing to begin to work on. So we all rallied to get the OAU to make it successful. But after the OAU, we returned to the process of trying to democratize the Liberian society and engaging each other in a process that we hope would have gotten us a more democratic system. Some of the events that took place thereafter had some unfortunate consequences as a result of the government's reaction to them. For example, in March of 1980, the Progressive People's Party, that had now been registered, published what they call a declaration of intent. In that statement, they outlined the failings of the government, and they called for the resignation of the president and vice president. The response of the government was, after back and forth, was indeed to arrest and detain the leaders, and to detain with them many leading sympathizers of the PPP. The press went hysterical on the diabolical plot and all of that, whipping flames of passion. And rumors began to circulate that the leaders of PPP and their leading sympathizers would be tried and executed. These rumors were rife across this country. Unfortunately, the government did not take a move to quell them. I think this was a fatal mistake. And I'm saying this with the benefit of hindsight. And so I can tell you that on April 12th, I had gone to bed at about 11:30 the night before. And by 5:30 on the morning of April 12th, I was awakened by a friend who knocked on my window. And he said, "Oh, there has been a coup. Some soldiers have taken over the government." I jumped up in a state of confusion, put on some clothes, and I went into hiding. I went into hiding because, one, we didn't know who had taken over the government, but there had been rumors that, in fact reports, that some members of the ruling establishment in the legislature and generally in the society were trying to organize to have the president impeached. And so all kinds of ideas started running in my mind. Maybe instead of impeaching the president, this was a right-wing takeover. So I got out of the way, went with my friend into hiding, and I stayed out of sight for the full day, listening to the radio in my hiding place. When I returned home on Sunday afternoon, I was summoned to the executive mansion by the new junta. I met President, or then he was Master Sergeant Doe, and he said to me, "Prof, we got a thing here. I wanted you to be my Minister of State. But the people say, you can't speak Crown. So I want you to be my advisor." Upstairs, they got the president room. On the right of the president room, they got the Minister of State room. Then on the other side of the president room, they got one office there. That's where I want you to sit. Anything, me and you and the Minister of State will hang here. I told him, thanks for the offer, but I would rather stay at the university, and whenever he needed my advice, he would call on me. He said, well, what about this job, this mere job that you were trying to get? You're there now, why you don't go be mayor? I told him that I really didn't want that job. The reason why we were contesting as an independent was to ensure that the laws for competitive elections would be cleaned up before we had our next round of general elections, now that we were moving on a course of multi-party democracy. And so I went back to the university. In that 30 to 45-minute period, the commotion that I saw, the people being brought in, was clearly for me a sign that was troubling. We now had a situation on our hand that needed to be stabilized and a way found to move our country forward. And so I went to the university campus that Sunday evening and met some of my colleagues there. And while we were talking about my experience earlier in the day, we got a phone call, and then there was somebody who was sent from the mansion to ask whether we could write a speech for the new leader as he was contemplating addressing the nation to explain the coup and to chart the way forward. And we saw this as an opportunity to begin now to set the course. And so if you read the first speech written and delivered by the Master Sergeant, you will see all the aspirations. Because we thought at this time that if indeed you put these words into the pronouncements of the government, you then put the government on a course that it must deliver on. And so that Sunday afternoon, we tried to craft a simple speech, but a speech full of aspirations. From that point onward, my attention turned largely to university matters and to trying to help those who were suffering under the yoke of this regime and those who were trying to stabilize the situation. And I should say almost every evening, me and my colleagues, Dr. Fambule, Dr. Tipote, and others would meet and strategize as to how to move a situation from chaos to stability and how to begin to chart a way forward. About the executions, I recall mid-morning on the day of the executions, a young reporter who was covering the executive mansion came rushing to the university and said, I'm just coming from the executive mansion. They just had a meeting there and they've decided, they told the press that they are going to have the execution. They're going to execute some people. This young reporter, who was very nervous at the time, was Wiade Koba. Wiade had come with this news. She too was shaken. And immediately we got on the phone trying to find out what was going on. I called my colleagues who were in government. They too were just getting the news and in a panic. We began calling the mansion separately, calling elsewhere, and most of those people who we thought would be in the know, or I thought would be in the know of things, were not available. This situation of uncertainty continued into the early afternoon, when indeed it was announced that I think there were 13 people had been executed. The shock and the fear sent me straight home and straight to bed. This is my way of dealing with fear and uncertainty, to go to sleep. And so I went home. It was about 6:30 or thereabouts in the afternoon, in the evening, early evening, when Dr. Tipote came to see me. He was dejected. He sat down and opened his briefcase, and he handed me a letter that had a single paragraph. That was his letter of resignation. I panicked, and I pleaded with him not to resign. I was frightened that his resignation would mean danger for all of us who were associated with him and with others from Moja who were in the government. I advised him instead to begin to plan an orderly disengagement. No sooner had Dr. Tipote left my apartment, Dr. Fambule came. He was enraged. He told me he was going to resign. This time I was better prepared because I had thought through my arguments against it, and I strongly advised him not to do so. And instead, to do all he can, and that we all should, to see if we can have an impact on stabilizing the situation and on moving our country through a transition. A good deal of our discussions after this point was concentrated on strategies for quickening the transition from military rule. Several bull sessions were held, not only among Moja people, but with a lot of other people. Fambule, Mason, Tipote, student leaders like Kamine Wisa, Siafa Kamara, Dusty Wolokuli, lots of people were engaged in these strategy discussions. And others who were not of Moja, some of the PPP people, Deacon Kala, for example, and people who were not even of those groups, some religious leaders, former diplomats like G. Flaman Sherman and others, they were all consulted. There was considerable consultations about what do we do to move our country through a transition to normality. And as a result of these consultations, We in the leadership of Moja decided to write a memo, to draft a memo. That memo laid out how to move forward. It was that memo of which I had the principal task of drafting with the input of all my colleagues and many more people. It was that memo that was submitted to the People's Redemption Council through the Council of Advisors. And here I must give a lot of credit to D. Kankala, who at that time was a member of the council. He shepherded that memo through the council and got it adopted. It was that memo that laid the ground for the constitution review process, the process of elections, the entire agenda for transition from military rule. This was an important development because now we had a roadmap. Now sure, there were lots of other people working on, the brush fire operations. We too were doing some of that. But the key question here, for me and for many of us, how do we get a legitimate path out of this crisis? And a path that will not take us back to where we were coming from, but would move us forward. A path that will give us a more democratic set of institutions and pave the way for greater democratic development. And so what came out of the PRC as the roadmap setting up the Constitution Commission and the Elections Commission were in fact essentially that document. I should also give credit to the late Tangabai Jangaba, who was an advisor of the Assembly of the PRC at that time and did a lot of the crafting of the document working from this memo. And also to Bai Bala, who also as a member of the advisors, one of the advisors to the council, played a role in helping to get this process underway. So my selection to chair the Constitution Commission was not an accident. This is the background. It didn't come out of a hat, or it didn't come because, of any special reasons, other than the fact that I was deeply associated with the effort and with my colleagues to craft a roadmap and to move us forward. Now, since you asked that I talk about things that I have certain knowledge of, let me just move on to the Constitution process. Let me say that the Constitution that was adopted, what is called the 1986 Constitution, is not the draft Constitution that the commission I headed crafted. The draft Constitution created by the committee I chaired was given to the Constitution Advisory Assembly. Mine was a group of 25 people that met in Monrovia, held public hearings around this country, and drafted a constitution and put it to an advisory assembly. That assembly was mandated by then head of state Doe to make whatever changes it wanted to make. And so that constitution, which was ultimately promulgated, bears considerable departures from the draft constitution we submitted to it. I want to identify some of the differences. For example, the draft constitution we submitted called for the appointment of judges by the President from a list to be submitted by a Judicial Service Commission. So there was to be established a Judicial Service Commission, a group of professionals with integrity that will screen members of the legal profession for their capability and their integrity and make recommendations. And only from that list, the President would make the appointment of judges. We also proposed that the appointment of superintendents. Yes, we did not recommend, as we wanted to, the election of superintendents. We thought at that time that might be too radical a view, and some of us hoped that perhaps by this time Liberia would be ready for that, but we recommended that superintendents be appointed by the President, again from a panel, to be presented to the President by a committee of county leaders. And that committee of county leaders should be an institutionalized group in which the paramount and clan chiefs, the members of the legislature, and one representative from each district will be put together. And that's how we had proposed that this committee be constituted, such that the President would not go willy-nilly and appoint anybody he or she pleases to be superintendent. And that the superintendent will report to the President both through the Ministry of Internal Affairs as well as to this county council. We propose also that the President appoints military officers from the rank of colonel or the equivalent. That was changed, given the power to the President to appoint military officers from the rank of lieutenant, further politicizing our military. And I should say the three proposals I talked about earlier, judges and county superintendents, these were all eliminated from the draft that we sent forward to this assembly. I should also say that we proposed in that draft a tenure of office for the President of 4 years and of representatives for 4 years and of senators for 6 years. Those were changed by the Bangai Assembly, giving the President 6 years, members of the House of Representatives 6 years, and the Senate 9 years. We propose that upon the death of a President-elect, the incumbent should hold office and new elections should be held in 60 days. That is, if the Vice President has not already been inducted into office as President, if inauguration has not taken place, this President-elect dies. The Vice President-elect should hold office, or the incumbent, whoever has been President should hold office for 60 days, and we should hold fresh elections. That was changed so that the VP-elect would accede to the presidency. We had in that draft the provision for the declaration of assets, that senior officials of government should declare their assets before taking office. That proposal was eliminated. As I said, we had in that document the establishment of a Judicial Service Commission, and that should be done upon the recommendation of the Bar Association, and that proposal was taken out. We also had a provision for the appointment of the establishment of an ombudsman commission. Again, a group, an ombudsman, to intercede for people with the government. A 3-person commission was recommended. That proposal was eliminated. we proposed the creation of a public service commission, a standing commission that will do work broader than what the civil service agency is established to do. Well, that proposal was also removed and the civil service established and actually put under presidential control. And finally, we proposed that the office of the Auditor General should be protected by having it not report to the President, but to the legislature, giving the legislature oversight of that commission. I think that has been done through legislation. And so these are some of the differences that obtained between the draft done by the commission which I headed and the final document that came out of the Banga group, the Assembly, the Constitutional Advisory Assembly. After that assignment, I turned back to activities with my colleagues in Moja, and we were now in the process of trying to organize a political party. That process was one in which I played the role of chairman of the committee, the organizing committee. And of course, given the desire by this time of head of state Doe to become president, we began to experience a lot of difficulties. In fact, I should tell you my own difficulties with the administration then, the military, started before this time. It started because there were efforts to get us to make some changes in the draft constitution, including changing the minimum age of eligibility to become president from 35 to make it lower. And we were not prepared to do that. There were threats that the resources of the commission would be cut off. We then said that it would be a bad idea and that the Liberian people would be prepared to support the work of the commission. In any case, we went on amid difficulties to the extent that when we were indeed finished and the head of state had decided that he was going to run and turned over the document to the Constitutional Advisory Assembly in Banga, we of the Constitution Commission were banned from going to Banga. Any connection with the Constitutional Advisory Assembly was prohibited. Orders were out that we would be arrested if we crossed Kakata. And so there was no dialogue between ourselves and that assembly. Now, when the ban was lifted on politics as the period advanced and the creation of, the efforts now to form political parties, I joined my colleagues in Moja to announce the formation of the Liberian People's Party. Within weeks of that announcement, I was arrested and thrown in jail. But what is not known is that between the period of our meetings and announcement and my detention in the post-stockade, I had had a number of discussions with head of state Doe, trying to persuade him not to run to be president. My argument was this: Mr. President or Mr. Head of State, Liberia has already had a first president. What Liberia needs now is someone who will lead this process such that we are taken to a new democratic era. Well, needless to say, my arguments were not persuasive enough. And on the 19th of August, 1984, I was arrested and thrown in the post stockade. When I was released about 60 days or thereabouts later, thanks to the groundswell of protests and concerns and outcries from the students of the University of Liberia, from Liberian citizens around our country, and from international folks, thanks to all of that, when I was released, I was banned from participation in politics and banned from public affairs generally. I was virtually confined to house arrest because right at the entrance of my house, a gate, a checkpoint was put. Smothering security surveillance was instituted. Visitors who would dare to come to see me would be stopped and interrogated, and a lot of people got frightened to interact with me. In about between February and April, I don't have the exact date here, in 1985, there was an arson assault on my house in Caldwell. They tried to burn my house. To this day, the security has not fully investigated or given us any report. I stayed virtually under this condition until the political seasons took place. Mr. Doe was elected, and under the new constitution, I applied for a visa, for a passport, or I had a passport, applied for a visa and for exit permit. That was the thing of the time. You had to get this exit permit because there were these lists. And I was able to get the permit, and I left the country in 1986, shortly after the inauguration. I did not return until I came to the conference in Banjul. In the United States, I spent my time as an academic at Indiana University, where I did research, wrote professional articles that were published in peer-reviewed journals, and I wrote a book and a smaller monograph. The monograph recounted my experience during the very difficult years that we're discussing. I titled it Effective Immediately, Dictatorship in Liberia 1980 to 1986, a personal perspective. I submit to you a copy of that publication as it recounts sometimes in graphic details some of the issues that we've been discussing here today with you, Mr. Chairman. Let me go to the interim government. Because in 1989, I left Indiana University and put in a lot of time with other Liberians in an effort to get international pressure, largely United States pressure, so that there could be some kind of a peaceful change here in Liberia. And so those efforts were on when situations here on the ground escalated and the invasion of Liberia took place the December 24th, 1989 invasion of the forces of the NPFL took place. I was one of those invited to a conference in Banjul, the Gambia, to participate in the talks at that level. There had been talks in Freetown, and all kinds of efforts were afoot to work out a formula. The Interfaith Mediation Committee of Liberian religious leaders were in the forefront of these efforts. I was not an active participant in the Freetown talks. I got on board really in Banjul at the invitation of the ECOWAS Standing Mediation Committee. Now, why did ECOWAS get involved with the conflict in Liberia? Because the United Nations did not. It is the Security Council that has the mandate to ensure peace and order around the world. That mandate is in the UN Charter given to the Security Council. The Security Council of the United Nations did not step forward. The United States did not step forward. Part of our efforts in the US, along with other Liberians, was to lobby the United States government. We spent hours at the State Department and were told that the only interest the United States had or could do, the only thing the United States could do was to help in humanitarian relief and to ask the contending parties to open up a corridor to Freetown, a corridor to Sierra Leone. That is the road from Bushra Island going out. We were told that Liberians had this notion of a special relations with the United States, but the time for that special relations had passed. And the place for Liberia at this time was among its neighbors on the west coast of Africa. We were told this by the United States government. At that time, President Jawara, as chairman of ECOWAS, in his effort to move this process, the peace process, presided over initiatives to bring Liberians together. He called Liberia at that time a slaughterhouse, and that as there was fire on the neighbor's house, the sub-region could not stand by. This, Mr. Chairman, was the finest hour of West African solidarity. We in Liberia should never, I said never, have terrible things to say about our neighbors, about ECOWAS, and about ECOMOG. Because the people of this country who survived, good many of them, who stayed, owe their survival to the initiatives of this sub-region. It was later, much later, that the United Nations and other people came in, moving from humanitarian aid to actual support for ceasefire, demobilization, and all of that. And so, this ECOWAS initiative now led to the invitation to Liberians to meet in Banjul and to see if they could make a way to move ahead. I came from the United States to this meeting. Many other Liberians who were there came too. Large numbers of people, representatives of political parties here who were in Sierra Leone and who were elsewhere, made their way to Banjul. And the formula for peace that was put on the table was a formula initially proposed by the Liberian Interfaith Mediation Committee. It was adopted substantially by ECOWAS and called the ECOWAS Peace Plan. Let me give you the tenets, the important elements of that agreement. One, it called for a ceasefire There was a military section and a political section. The military section called for a ceasefire, for disarmament and demobilization, and to the reintegration of ex-combatants into the society. That military section would be governed largely by ECOMOG with the cooperation of the leaders of the armed groups. There was a political section. That political section called for the formation of an interim government. And that interim government should be all-inclusive, should involve all the warring factions, all the political parties, civil society organizations. It should be headed by someone who would not be eligible to run in the ensuing elections. This is important. The person who headed the interim government was barred from being a candidate in elections that were supposed to take place. The interim government and the entire process was supposed to last for 6 months. In other words, in 6 months, there should have been disarmament and demobilization, and elections should have been held. This interim government was supposed to serve for 6 months. It turned out initially that every faction, warring faction, every political party, including then the party of Mr. Doe, not only supported but participated in this government. I would wager that this was easily one of the broadest based governments that this country has had. The only exception was that the NPFL rejected the idea. And so what was to happen next? The position of a second vice president was first reserved, of a vice president was reserved for the NPFL in case they wanted to come on board. We said, no, let's go on and have a vice president. But if indeed the NPFL is ready, let us reconfigure the government. And so we were taken on a conference circuit from capital to capital to capital in search of an agreement that the NPFL would sign on to. Meeting after meeting. First, Yamoussoukro. President Houphouët-Boigny held 6 meetings, or 5 meetings. Mr. Taylor said he wanted some forces. He didn't trust the Nigerians, he wanted the Senegalese. The Senegalese were brought on board. We agreed a timetable for elections. But before elections, the forces of ECOMOG, now having been reconstituted, should be spread across the country. Some of you will recall when those forces began to move up to Kakata and beyond, there were resistance. But the Liberian people then began to vote with their feet. Large numbers of people from across the line started to flock this way. And we went on and on and on in search for a solution to bring the NPFL on board. By this time, as the fighting escalated and the NPFL was really determined, the casualties were mounting. The Ghanaian government took a position that its casualties were getting too high. There was a transition developing in Ghana. President Rawlings gave his troops the orders to shoot only in self-defense. And so when you hear that, ECOMOG was not pursuing the people, or you hear that, oh, Sawyer stopped the people from pursuing, the kind of dissension and disagreements that existed within the countries that produced ECOMOG was never fully understood. The Nigerians subsidized the provision of fuel for the Ghanaians and other forces. President Rawlings was now looking at a transition. The opposition was on his back. And as a result of this, I remember in one of the meetings we attended, he called me into a special meeting and said, look, I don't think we can make this thing if my forces continue to suffer casualties. The ECOMOG commander is bent on pursuing the Taylor forces. We would appreciate were you to ask them to hold on, because we want to bring Mr. Taylor here to Accra so we can have a discussion. And so we asked for a halt so that there could be those discussions. Rawlings was deceived, so were many others, including President Hufebwenye, because you will recall we went from conference to conference to conference with no results in hand, and none in sight. So, the interim government, therefore, continued long past that 6 months in this search to get the MPF on board. And this never happened. But what did happen during this period of the stewardship of the interim government which I headed? This government sat in Monrovia. There are no forests in Monrovia, so there were no natural resource intake. No money coming from gold or diamond. I haven't seen a diamond creek on Broad Street yet. And so what resources did this government have to operate with, this interim government? It had at its disposal resources from the maritime funds. And even that, it took a struggle, because banks had put lien on those monies, and lawyers, some of whom are practicing and active today, were part of the effort to deny the interim government access to those resources. Those resources ranged at the time from something like 250,000 to about 500,000 a month. And what did we do with that money? We paid salaries. For those of you who were around and are old enough to know, when the interim government left office, there was barely an arrear in salary payments. Maybe 1 month, maybe 2 months, but not more than that. We kept our faith with the Liberian people. We paid salaries. If you recall, we had electricity. We bought fuel. We were restoring the electrical fixtures up to Airfield Road, up to Somalia Drive, and we were working diligently and honestly from that money. We imported through the business community here essential commodities. There was everything. You could buy things, and you could buy them at affordable prices. By the time the interim government ended, or before Octopus, the Liberian dollar was strong. It was 7 Liberian dollars to 1 United States dollar. I'm proud we could do that. When Octopus took place and the NPFL tried to invade the city, the destruction of infrastructure, the confidence problems that caused, the dollar began to grow weak. By the time we were leaving office, the dollar was between 11 and 15 to the US dollar. Still remarkable compared to today's standards. How did we do this? I credit some knowledgeable and patriotic Liberians. Byron Tarr, James Holder, may his soul rest in peace, David Vinton, Francis Kape, J. Sebastian Bush, may his soul rest in peace. The current Minister of State for without portfolio, who was Jim Holder's deputy, Onari Davis. He served at Commerce at the time. And there are many others. Josiah Brown, who was deputy at Finance. These people gave of their ingenuity, their skills, and their patriotism. They are not people who looted this country. In fact, let me tell you some more. Because there are people who are mad at this accomplishment. Because we're able to achieve this accomplishment by instituting measures that led to the change of the currency. We changed the banknote. We changed that banknote because banks around this country had been looted. There were people holding containers of money. The people who are the financial experts, they tell us that they did not, the bankers, they said they didn't even know how much money was in circulation. Banks had been robbed. Had we not taken that move, you would have needed a wheelbarrow load of money to buy a loaf of bread. We treated the currency situation as a security issue. These banks were looted all around this country. Remember, there were agriculture banks and banks all around the place. They were all looted. And so, in consultation with the ECOWAS authorities, and under strict secrecy, given a need-to-know basis, we had the currency changed and we put many people out of business. Happily so. I am proud of that. We rescued the economy, and in the process, we impoverished a lot of looters. And I say that with pride, and if I had to do it again, I'll do it the same way. So all those people who carry a malice, all those people who carry a grudge, all those people who get hysterical, if their hysterical conditions is the result of a pathology, those pathologies should either be addressed or ignored. But we are about serious business for this country. And so that's what we did. We did another thing, which I'm very proud of. We organized the Black Beret. There was a time in this city when even with the presence of ECOMOG, the place was very insecure. Grenades were being shot all over the place. limbs were flying off, people were getting killed. The credibility of our forces were at stake. There was a concerted effort to destabilize this haven, and we were not about to let that happen. So what did we do? We consulted with the leaders of this sub-region, from the president of Nigeria, the president of Ghana, the president of Guinea, the entire works. And we proposed to them that we wanted an auxiliary force, much like a gendarmerie, if you will, of Liberians who knew the terrain and who would in fact work along with the forces of ECOMOG. They agreed. And that is why those forces were trained in Guinea, not anywhere else. And if you remember, Guinea had one of the major contingencies here on the ground, fully by Guinea, fully with the full knowledge of the ECOWAS authorities. There were efforts to disparage this initiative, and it happened that when Octopus was orchestrated and the MPFL tried to take over this city, working hand in hand with ECOMOG and with the men and women of the armed forces of Liberia that still remained in Monrovia and cooperative, the beret performed with distinction. I personally have nothing but thanks and gratitude to those young men who sacrificed their lives to keep this place safe. And again, Mr. Chairman, if I had to do it again, I would do it all over again, the same way. So that is about the beret, the black beret. Now, let me conclude with a few recommendations. The first recommendation I have for you, Mr. Chairman, is that you would need to find the Brunel report and study it closely, because that report is as close as you can get to an authoritative account of what happened in April 14, 1979. The recommendations of that report included the need for a code of conduct to guide the behavior of public officials, the dissolution of the Rice Committee and opening up of the market on rice, with the government ensuring quality and standards and ensuring a constancy of supplies. It called also for an investigation of the conduct of a number of leading members of government, especially those who had security responsibilities. And it also called for the scaling down of the extensive business activities of the president and his family. So I recommend you might want to go back to that report. Let me also now turn to some recommendations that, in my view, flow from the train of events. The first recommendation of this type that I have for you is that I think we need, in this country, to account for all those who are known to have died or are missing or have been missing as a result of a quarter century of violent conflict. To know their identities. These are human beings. These are our people. To know the circumstances of their death or the circumstances surrounding their departure. We need a full accounting. Other people take this seriously, so should we. Secondly, Mr. Chairman, we need to memorialize this tragic period of our history by preserving the relics, the objects, the symbols, the artifacts of war, all that are associated with this period, so that they become a lesson to our children and a reminder to ourselves, to our posterity, that never again should we visit such tragedy on ourselves or on others. Thirdly, for the purposes of justice as associated with the search for truth to be served, and to use this as a basis for reconciliation, I think it is important to ensure that people who come here and take oaths and are found to be lying and to do so deliberately, that those people be prosecuted. They must be prosecuted if the integrity of this body is to be taken seriously. Your work must not be taken lightly by other people, and you must not permit people to come here to lie on other people and to lie on their own roles and get away with it. They must face the full weight of the law. Number 4, as part of our quest to become a more inclusive society, I think it is important that as a result of your work and some of the other work doing on governance reform, we begin to look at some of our foundational symbols such that we can all be able to identify with this, our heritage. I think one of those symbols that reflects division, and the division of the past, is our national motto, the love of liberty brought us here. I think we should change it, and I propose just a slight adjustment. It is not original to me. One of my students proposed this some 30 years ago, that we should use as our motto, the love of liberty unite us here. Number 5, similarly, we need new narratives and interpretations of our past, so that our history reflects the accomplishments of all sectors of our society and the roles of all sectors as positive contributors to Liberian history. Our history is skewed, terribly skewed. It makes some people look bad, and it elevates others to saintly stages. This country of ours is a mosaic. I used to say this in my lectures to my students 30 years ago. I think it is true. A mosaic is a picture that contains many small parts, and all those parts come together to form this picture. If any one part is missing, the picture is incomplete. Let us think about the Liberian mosaic, and let us reconstruct it in our history in our symbols so that we can all identify with it. Let us do so, number 6, with all our other national symbols and other elements of our history that degrade some subcultures and some portions of our population. There is something we have here which is a fallacy of our history about mandingos. Long before settlers came here, mandingos were an integral part of the political and social landscape of this area. It is a distortion of history and an injury to our national body to begin to create identities that exclude from the body politic any group of our people, especially in this sense, the Mandingos. I can give you a history lesson on this. When Sauboso came to the coast, and by the way, Sauboso was a Mandingo, and he had a confederation, the Kondo Confederation, that was the most multi-ethnic that we had seen during that period. He cooperated with the settlers in ensuring that there were trade routes going up to the kingdom of the Western Mandingos in Musadu, linking with the kingdom of the Western Mandingo in Musadu was a goal of the settlers. And if you read the accounts of B.J.K. Anderson, written in 1868 and thereabouts, he tells you about the joining to Musadu, and he talks about this kingdom in a faraway land and the people with whom they were trying to forge a relationship. And so let's pull back from these prejudices that sometimes find their way as if they are truths. Let's pull back from them. Number 7, we need to aggressively promote our Liberian culture, including Liberian languages, to teach them in our schools and to use them in our social discourses. Number 8, on education. We now face a situation, Mr. Chairman, where about half of our population is under the age of 25. And this automatically says to us that we are a generation of young people. When considered in the context of 25 years of conflict, of civil war and intermittent conflict, we know how our schools have been affected. Our educational system is substandard. Our government is trying. Our Ministry of Education is trying. There's some really good people there. But I think we need to raise our educational agenda to a national campaign, such that it would be one of the few things that we say we must do, and there must be no resource that we can mobilize domestically or internationally to promote. We should do so in a way that will promote, in my view, a strategy that will give preference and emphasis to the education of girls. They are the mothers. They are the most disadvantaged. Every international study on development will tell us that the education of the woman and the girl is, and the health care of the woman and the girl, this is the tide that will raise all boats. There is no society that can aspire to development if your women and your girls are not prioritized in the educational process. We have to do this here. And we need not apologize. I know Madam President is a woman and might think that, well, to do so, what will the people say? But there are some men who feel strongly about this and want to join her in promoting the education of women and girls as a cornerstone for the development of our country. Number 8, we must move forward with our efforts to develop a democratic system of government through the processes of decentralization. Too much harm and conflict has come to our country because too many people have pursued power, because power is centralized in the presidency. Let us demystify the presidency in that sense, and let us now create other centers of authority, of constitutional authority at the level of the counties. Let some of our people who are ambitious go to run to be superintendents and want to serve as commissioners of education or of health in the counties. So let us undertake a process of constitutional devolution that would put some authority, substantial authority, at the level of the county. Have county councils and the like. And I'm very pleased that this is underway as part of the governance agenda, and I'm very pleased that the President has given me an opportunity to be a part of this initiative. I would like to also talk a bit in my recommendation about economic governance. As I said in my submission, we have too frequently looked at the concession granting approach to economic development. So we appeal to bring people here to do development, economic development here. And in that process, we try to get jobs for our people. Yes, we should do that, but that should not be the only thing we do. We need to encourage Liberian entrepreneurship. There is need for Liberian participation in wealth creation as shareholders in corporate Liberia, to help our business people, small business people, large business people, to encourage the Marketing Association to go one step higher into business. We need national policies that will help us improve and increase Liberians' stake in their own economy. If your people do not own anything or much, they will not have too much to protect, and they will not want to protect them. I also propose here to you that we all join and make some effort to get the legislature to pass the Code of Conduct. This body has passed the Anti-Corruption Act, but there is a need for a Code of Conduct. In the interim government, we tried to get one passed. The interim legislative assembly did not do so. As you heard in the Brunel report, as far back as 1979, that proposal was made. It was not passed at the time. This legislature is challenged to pass a code of conduct, and I think all of us should appeal and or pressure that the legislature would pass a code of conduct that it now has before it. And so the other governance reform that are going on, I think we should encourage. These include the establishment of multi-party political systems, the development of a system of public integrity, as I've said, the establishment of a system of decentralization and constitutionally based local government, the undertaking of legal and judicial reform, and ultimately undertaking constitutional reform. My last recommendation is that as a result of your work and all of the reform activities, we should think about holding a national conference. This idea was proposed before the elections. Our national agenda at that time was controlled by the international community. And working on the timetable of the international community, there was no place for a national conference. I think now that we have put together our government an agenda for reform, that agenda, even as we implement it, needs deep-rooted validation by all sectors of the Liberian society. We need to hold a national conference to validate and gain broad-based support for a national agenda, support that will go across all of the political parties and all of the communities. We need, Mr. Chairman, from such a national conference to consider reaching a compact amongst ourselves as Liberians. A compact regarding what should be considered as the acceptable limits of conflict. A compact to respect each other and to respect our institutions and to ensure to all Liberians the political, social, economic space to participate in their society regardless of political persuasion or ethnic and regional identity. Mr. Chairman, I thank you and members of the TRC for being patient with me and for giving me an opportunity to make this presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Witness, for your presentation before this body and on this day. You've taken us through the processes of your experience dating back to the early 70s, 1979, your experiences of the 80s, and then your incumbency as head of the interim government of national unity. You went further also to advance concrete recommendations for our consideration, which may go beyond the work of the Commission, but takes into consideration several parallel reform processes that are ongoing in our country. We appreciate that very much, and we take note of your opening comments, which prefix your presentation. We certainly will appreciate if there are other personalities who fall within a category of policymakers at the time during the advocacy for change who could assist the work of the Commission. We have tried as a Commission to reach out to as many persons as possible. Perhaps as your letter of invitation indicated, if there are others you think we can reach to, we appreciate if that information can be provided to the Commission. Also is the issue of corroboration. We do agree that these hearings are just a fraction of our inquiry process, and hearing from everybody as much as possible who have insights, who were participants, who were present doing research and resourcing, secondary resources as well, will help to complement our inquiry process and provide the level of corroboration that will be necessary so that the final accounts of the Commission can represent the universal truth of what transpired during our process. And then the issue of perjury. We also agree that that is a very serious matter, and the TRC Act is explicit on that. But what we would like to emphasize is that if one comes and pledges to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, and there are information contrary to what the witness has provided, we will appreciate that information, which provides the basis for investigation and ascertaining that perjury was committed. To date, there is one case that is being considered for investigation because people came forward with information that what the witness said on the stand was contrary to the truth, and they provided witnesses that can support that. The Commission is also considering that. So we thank you very much for coming and spending this time with us. Usually at this time we take questions from commissioners, but with your indulgence, and if it is okay with you, we could continue with the questioning, or we take a break at around 2:30 or 2:45, and then resume around 3:30. Okay, thank you, sir. And with that, we move to Commissioner Sheck of Marcona.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Witness, for coming before us to testify on so many issues. Before I go on to question you, I would like to remind you of one important issues concerning the BlackBerry. I don't know whether it was a deliberate or you forgot. You will recall at a certain time the Ghanaian government was threatening to withdraw its ECOMO forces here. And as the political situation is within the West African region, Nigeria were using the presence of Ghanaian ECOMO as a justification of Nigerian forces being here in order to avoid destabilization of the West African region. And so when that threatening was becoming very serious, that was one of the rationale behind the establishment of the BlackBerry. So in case of any eventuality, Monrovia can be saved from imminent danger while the treaties of defense treaty that was signed is being implemented. Having said that, I see you as one of those national depositories of Liberia. And I don't know whether you will agree with me. If you do, I would like to ask you, reflecting over the past, first as a student, then as a teacher, as a professor, as an advocate, and then during our most conflict situation time as national leader, what can you say that is the difference between the perception of theory and practical, taking into account of your past history? Should I continue?
No, if you're done, I mean.
Okay. My second question.
Well, let me just quickly answer this one, since
Okay.
it may not.
Okay.
I think, well, let me thank you first for your recollections. And I should say that without any prejudice to this undertaking, your own role in the peace process was tremendously helpful the respect that people of this sub-region and esteem in which they hold you as a result of these efforts is a credit not only to you but to our country. And you and Bishop Michael Francis and a few other prelates were extremely important in the search for peace, and we thank you very much. The question about, the reminder about the dynamics of the politics of ECOWAS is so correct. I don't think many people realize how much it took to keep the Ghanaians here. The persuasion, and let us, be candid about it. There were lots of political developments in the sub-region during that time. Ghana was making a transition from a heavy support on Libya to trying to quote some Western support, but yet there was very strong Libyan involvement. The NPFL was in fact backed by the Libyans, and so the Ghanaians themselves were playing a chess game, trying to get the rest of ECOWAS and the Libyans together, the rest of the Liberian groups and the forces of Mr. Taylor together, basically getting the Libyans to help out. They even arranged that I visited Tripoli to talk to Colonel Gaddafi and see if he would support the peace process here. And the Ghanaians were threatening time and time again to withdraw. And you're very right, the Nigerians were very keen on ensuring a multinational force. It is not that the Nigerians could not have supported this force alone, but it wanted it to become a West African force and to remain that way. And so there was every effort to keep the Ghanaians on board. So any suggestion by the Ghanaians regarding pulling out was something that needed to be responded to. Our safeguards, as discussed in the sub-region, was that a Liberian force would be brought up to 1,000 strong. We didn't have the opportunity or the resources to do so, but with their knowledge and approval, we had every intention of training 1,000 men in the beret to work along with ECOMOG. We never really could make it. There was resource constraints, and also there were time constraints too. Regarding theory and practice, I think, the whole idea of a process of disarmament, demobilization that would take place in 6 months, or an interim government of all factions and all tendencies that will guide the political dimensions of this process and be done for 6 months. All of this sounded good on paper and in theory. But the reality, and this is the thing about theory and practice, the realities on the ground did not allow it to happen. And I have learned that as a social scientist, whatever looks good in a model and in theory, unless it is played out on the ground, you cannot rely on the fact that it is logically consistent and all of its elements look good. It may not be workable. So I've learned that through these exercises.
Thank you. It is held in some jurisdiction that heart is regarded as the center of ideas, perception, plans, and actions. Heart is where all these things start. And if this fact are held to, in your personal opinion, was it necessary for April 12 coup, taking into consideration that President Toro had the desire of change, but only needed some time to convince his collaborator, his colleagues, and others. How do you look at the incident of April 12? Does it disrupt that plan, or it brings into reality what the desired effort was, change Liberia for the better?
I think President Talbot was a man of good intentions, a man who did very many good things here. As far as I said, the development agenda is concerned, until we see the unfolding of things under this administration and subsequent ones, he still remains very high among those presidents who made quite a bit of material accomplishments on the ground. I think he was a transitional president in the sense that he was presiding over an era that was ending and did not have with him in the ruling group sufficient support, given the way the group was structured, sufficient support to move on a trajectory of change. And had he had that type of support, I think he would have been able to open up the political process a bit more. And let me also say, for myself, and I'm sure for those of us who wanted change, what we saw was perhaps more an illusion of what we thought was. And let me say this about the Truitt Party and this Truitt Party government. When we started off in the mayor contest, I was convinced that the grand old Truitt Party, with men of long years of experience and who had this informal way of doing things, that it would not be too long that would have found some way to disqualify this campaign. But by that time, the regime itself had gotten rusty. It was much of a hollow and could not withstand the pressure that was put on it. I remember going to the Elections Commission and asking for the books, the electoral rolls. The books, the pages in the books were yellow. Dust were on the cover. They had not been opened for years. So the system had gotten rusty. You know, it's like a big hollow tree. It may be standing, but the roots were rotten, so it takes a little wind to blow it down. Now, what would have happened if the coup had not taken place? I don't want to hazard a guess. Perhaps the Truitt Party would have remained on a reformatory course. But if you recall, up to the Buchanan Convention, when at that time all eyes were on the reform elements in the party, the one signal that many people were looking for was whether the party would elect Jackson Doe into a position, I think, of party chairman or something of that sort. That was a huge symbolic failure. And a lot of people then began to give up as to whether this party was sufficiently responsive, sufficiently flexible, malleable, that it could lead a process to change. But I wouldn't want to hazard a guess as to what indeed would have happened had the coup not taken place. I can also say, however, that it is for us now that the coup did take place, and that a lot of blood has been spilled, and a civil war ensued, that we come out of this experience to protect the gains that so many people have died for. And that was a gain to ensure a democratization process, that there will be multiple parties, that freedom of speech will continue, that there will be no hindrance to the vote, that office we call the presidency is now available to everybody. I was delighted, as many people were unhappy. I was delighted in the last elections when in fact there were candidates from virtually every county contesting the elections, from Nimba, from Bong, from Lofa, from Granjere, all over the place. So this means here we are on the road to democratization, but it is a road for which we have paid a huge price. And I think it is for us to covenant among ourselves that we will not fight among ourselves again, but we will continue on a democratic trajectory.
My reason of asking this question is that there was every reason to believe at the time you announced your desire to run for the mayorship of this city. It is an open secret that the Tory party was oversaturated with fear. And that is, if the election was to take place at that moment, you were going to carry it victoriously. Now it was possible, and it was within their political maneuvering to defer the mayoral election. But the presidential election, the presidential and general election could not have been that way. And the same fear that saturated them could have been the same problem, but could not be avoided, and that could have been a peaceful democratic transition. Don't you think so?
I think so, and this was indeed our motivation. I studied political science. I have taught political science. I may not know many other things, but I do know that when you have a system in which there is increased demands for participation, and you have a machinery for participation that needs to be revised so that it can in fact accommodate this change, you are better off making an adjustment in rearranging the system than in trying to stifle the participation of people. It is like a dam. You need to readjust the dam so the waters can flow. And if you don't do that, you get into serious problems. And in this case, the way forward for it, for the change, was through the electoral process. That is why, if you recall, the entire mayoral campaign was centered around two issues. One, the removal of the property clause, and two, the issue of ensuring open registration and voting processes, something that was very important if a peaceful change would have come through the ballot box. And because President Talbot said that it was his desire also to remove those barriers, the property clause, and to revise the electoral system, that's why we agreed to the postponement of elections so these processes can take place. I think it is fair to say that even under those conditions, and with the public's desire to vote, the government would have had a hard time stopping people from going to vote had they not changed the laws or postponed the elections. And they would have had a big problem because it appears that many of those people who were going to vote for me. And it would have caused a serious legal problem. So I think looking back on this, I wish that process had worked its way through. I think we would have all been better off today.
While it is true that property clause and taxation are two separate and distinct things, it is held that citizenship entails not only rights but also responsibilities. Exercise of franchise is among these rights, and payment of tax is also among these responsibilities. Taking into account the contention being raised, particularly during our last election, where it was, in 1987 election, what it was said, you came mama, you came papa, I will vote for you. In the last election, it was said, you know book, you don't know book, I vote for you. And the majority of those who saying this, particularly the latter one, are those that you refer to them as being almost 45% of the Liberian population. And they are, by and large, non-tax payers. What will be your scientific comment on this one?
I think, Commissioner, we face a very serious problem in this country. First, a challenge to get that body of individuals to become interested in education, and where they are interested in education, to provide education. I know there is an effort sometimes, and we heard that here, some of your witnesses, to disparage education. But I don't know a country that has been built on ignorance. You need your professional people. You need educated people. We owe it to our children, given the fact that they have been denied good education for so long, to begin to reconstruct or to advance the reconstruction of the education industry here, so that those people who, because of the lack of skills and the lack of resources, are not involved in income-generating, wealth-creating activities, and therefore are unable to pay taxes, that they can be brought into this category of full citizenship as you defined it. People who have the privilege of participation and have the responsibility to support the system of governance. This is our challenge, and we need to meet it.
Lastly, it is said that taking law into one's own hands infringes the principle of due process. It was said yesteryear that Liberia needs drastic change, and we also need to take our destiny into our own hands. How do you differentiate the terminology of the two? taking law into one's own hands is a violation of the due process, and taking one's own destiny into your own hand could not infringe on the rights of another.
No, I think there's a serious distinction there, because one is about lawlessness and the other is about self-governance and self-development. When you talk about taking the law into your own hands, it means breaking the law, and it means operating in a situation of anarchy, because then everybody takes the law into their hands and everybody then does what he pleases until subdued by others. So the strong survive in a situation like that. This is the so-called state of nature, where order has disappeared and the rule of law doesn't obtain. It is for us to establish a rule of law, but ensure that the laws are fair, transparently applied, and that they are compatible with the norms of democratic governance, of human rights, and all those things we aspire to. So there must be a rule of law, but in the context we're talking about here. The first issue you gave about the taking destiny in your own hands, I think it's important for a country. Too often, countries are dictated to in terms of what their development agenda should be. That, this becomes the fad of an international community. As we've seen, there's been a time when we were told that structural adjustment was the way forward, and all of our economic policies had to conform to structural adjustments. There was a time when they say the integrated rural development approach was the best possible. Today they talk about poverty reduction. So all of these are internationally driven models that serve for a period. Now we know we are dependent in some ways, but we like to change that dependency to interdependency, where there will be a meeting of the minds, where we as Liberians will sit with international partners, and that we would fashion a policy and an approach that is compatible with our realities and that meets our own needs. That, I think, is what you talk about as taking your destiny into your own hands. And I think this is not bad, because then you measure your programs according to your own needs and the aspirations of your people. You use your own resources as the core, the seed money upon which you build with other people's help. But you then determine what the agenda looks like. And so I believe that if this is what taking one's destiny into one's own hands is all about, it's a good idea.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir.
At this stage, we'll take a break for 1 hour and resume at 4 p.m.